Hi, I'm Alex Stabany, Director of Computer Technologies Program. Today we'll be talking about workplace accommodation. What makes an employee qualified? What are essential functions of the job? And what is a reasonable accommodation? First, a disclaimer. This presentation was not prepared or reviewed by a lawyer specializing in accommodations. It's not legal advice, and it is for informational purposes only. Every person's situation is unique. This presentation relates to the accommodations in the workplace, which is differences from accommodations in an educational environment. If you need legal assistance, consider contacting a lawyer or the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, for guidance. So if you don't watch this video, I hope you do. It has a lot of good information. Here's a quick summary. Accommodation is about empowering a person with a disability to be able to do the job. Accommodations can be many things depending on the situation. Limits to accommodations are defined by what will work and reasonableness. This presentation is about what workplace accommodations are, examples of them, and how it all works. If you are a person with a disability and you are looking for information about how to request a workplace accommodation, we have a separate presentation on that will help you with that specific question. So first, we'll start with the law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's designed to protect people with disabilities from discrimination and to empower them on the job. It defines workplace accommodation as assistance or changes to a position or workplace that will enable an employee to do their job or participate in the hiring process. The ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified employees with disabilities, and thus doing so would pose an undue hardship. It's a fairly simple statement, but we need to define these three words to really understand what it means. Some key points about accommodations. Accommodations are intended to empower an employee to be able to do their job. Essential functions of a job cannot be eliminated as an ADA accommodation. And that's a really important point. The reason why an employer is hiring somebody is to perform the essential functions of that job. So it would be sensible to have those responsibilities eliminated as an accommodation. Now, can an employer eliminate or modify an essential function of the job for an employee? Well, of course, it's ultimately their job to define. And so they can eliminate or modify those essential functions, but those would be an ordinary accommodation and not one required by law. An employee must meet the same expectations of productivity and quality of work as all other employees. So what does this qualified word mean? What makes for a qualified employee? Well, the first part is our day-to-day meaning of the word qualified. Any job seeker will know this is a person who meets the skills, experience, education, and other requirements expected of all job applicants. You look in the job listings, most will clearly explain what skills, experience, education you need in order to be qualified for this position. But the second part is a person who can perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodation. So is the person able to do the job? If they can do the job with an accommodation, then that's fine. They're a qualified employee. If they're not able to do the job with or without an accommodation, then they are not qualified for the job. So essential functions. It's basically the work that defines a role. Tasks that everyone in the role needs to do. And everyone in the role must be able to do these with or without accommodation. The classic example that's used is a receptionist. Receptionist essential functions likely include answering the phone, providing information. You can take this example a little bit further. In a specific receptionist position, the essential functions might be defined as answering and transferring a high volume of phone calls, sorting and delivering mail to office staff, greeting visitors when they arrive for meetings with management or sales staff. And shall we just think for ourselves for a minute, if in general, can a deaf person be a receptionist? And I think the answer should probably be, it depends. In some positions, the receptionist may not have to answer many calls or perhaps only handle internal calls in the business. And an accommodation of a relay service or something similar to that might be a sufficient accommodation to allow this person to do the job. Now, in this specific role, it says a high volume of phone calls. In the case of a high volume, a relay service is probably not practical or reasonable. It's probably not going to allow the person to perform at the level of performance that's expected of any other employee in this position. So it really depends. In many receptionist roles, the job probably could not be accommodated to a deaf person, but there are other cases where it potentially could. Alongside essential functions, we also have the concept of marginal tasks. And these are additional tasks that an employee is asked to do, but not a regular part of the job. Tasks outside of the primary purpose of the role. In the receptionist example, it might be that the employer asks the receptionist to make coffee for a meeting that's happening. It's not, making coffee does not define the role of being a receptionist, but it's just an additional task that is not regularly part of the person's job that they're asked to do. Another example is an office clerk who's asked to cover the phones while the receptionist is away for an appointment. It's not a regular part of their job, it's just a one-time thing, or maybe it's an infrequent, occasional thing. If that office clerk is deaf, how can we handle this situation? It's possible that if it's not a high volume phone answering situation, that a accommodation for that phone could be made, a relay service or something similar, and it might be perfectly sufficient. And this employee could do this marginal task. However, the employee could ask for this marginal task to be eliminated from their job, and that could be considered a reasonable accommodation. So what are examples of accommodations? And the problem with this is there are just so many possibilities. Everyone is a unique individual. Every employment situation is different. Every combination of those things is different. And so there's definitely no one size fits all. Most accommodations are not difficult to provide, but sometimes they do need a little bit of figuring to make them work. The most common accommodation by far that we see in our work over nearly 50 years with literally thousands of people is schedule modifications. And that's for required appointments or for work tolerance or for needing to take a medication during the day, something of that nature. If the job can allow for a schedule modification, then this is a simple accommodation for an employer to provide. And in fact, people without disabilities ask for schedule modifications all the time for various reasons. So it's something that employers are very used to, and it can be a very simple thing to accommodate. When we think of accommodations, we often think of software hardware. Accessibility software installed on a computer or some device, physical modification of a workstation, height adjustable desk, desks that a wheelchair can fit under, screen enlargement software, text-to-speech, speech-to-text, what have you, alternative input devices, specialized keyboards and mice. There's just a whole universe of possibilities in this area. But these days, most of the common accessibility needs are built into our software already, for example. So Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, they have screen enlargement, they have screen readers, they have all kinds of accessibility built into them. Sometimes that's sufficient. Other times we'll need to have third-party software installed that handles things in a better way for a particular individual. Generally, they'll already have been trained on this equipment or this software. They'll know exactly what it is, and they'll generally bring it with them, but that may not always be the case. An accessible work area and/or parking. All modern buildings are going to be made to ADA standards, which will require there's a certain minimum level of physical access to the building. And same thing with parking. That older building's been updated, it's probably been updated to ADA standards. Some are older buildings, historic buildings, things of that nature, maybe have not yet or will never be. So the person needs to be able to get to their workplace to be able to perform the job. If they have a mobility impairment, then they need parking space, which is closer to where they're working, so they don't have to travel quite as far to get to the office or whatever the situation may be. Setting. So some people are highly sensitive to noise and lighting or foot traffic. It's too distracting or too irritating for them to be able to focus on their work. We've seen this from time to time, and generally just relocating the person in the office is sufficient. Allowing them to bring in or providing them with their preferred type of lighting is also a possibility. In general, we found these to be relatively easy to accommodate and really make a big difference for certain individuals. Job reorganization or reassignment. So reorganization can mean a lot of different things, but it can be as simple as the employer providing a checklist for the employee to follow to make sure they're getting all their work done. It could be the sequence or the order in which the work is done, things of that nature. They still need to do the job, but the way in which they do the job might be a little different. And reassignment is also another possible accommodation where the person's asked to be transferred to a different position within the company that will be a better fit for them. Again, this may not be a disability-related accommodation even, but this is a possibility. Alternative formats. Some people do better if they receive instructions verbally, or if they get them in writing, or in a large print, things of this nature. In our modern computerized era, these things are extremely easy to accommodate, sometimes already built into the system you're using. And if someone requires a service animal as an accommodation, then the employer will need to allow that. There's just so many possibilities here. If only there was an encyclopedia of all this information and all these possibilities. And guess what there is? It's called the Job Accommodations Network, or JAN, askjan.org, and it's considered by many to be the gold standard for identifying potential accommodations. This site is just a gold mine of information for everybody, people with disabilities, people without disabilities, you name it. You will be amazed by the kind of information and the things that you can learn on this website. If you're an employer trying to figure out, well, what makes for a reasonable accommodation? What could accommodations be for one of my employees? This is the site for you. It can really be helpful to you. If you're an employee with a disability and you're wondering, what kinds of things can I ask for? What might be a reasonable accommodation? What might help me succeed in my job? Again, this website, goldmine. Everyone should know about it. All right, so those are possible accommodations. What are not going to be accommodations? And as we know, first one, you can't eliminate essential functions of the job. Again, an employer is hiring an employee to do the job. It doesn't make sense that the accommodation is to not do the job. That's just not a thing. Alter expectations applied to everyone in the same position. You need to be able to do the job just as well as everybody else in that role is expected to. Same level of productivity. You can't request extra paid leave because you have some situation that you have to take care of. You're held to the same expectations as everybody else in that position. Of course, you can ask, and the employer may grant these things, but it is not a accommodation required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. An accommodation can't cause undue hardship to the company. And what can undo? How do we define that? Well, one example is if the employer has to hire additional staff to accommodate a person with a disability, that would be considered an undue hardship. If it was excessively expensive, the requested accommodation. What's excessive? Well, if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, your financial resources are tremendous. And so it's going to be a much different answer than what's excessive for a sole proprietor who has very limited financial resources. Most accommodations are not expensive. They can be, of course, but it's not that common. And most companies can absorb these small costs without any real concern. And finally, the accommodation can be an undue hardship if it's just not practical. One example that we've discussed here is someone who wanted to be a social worker, but part of the job was visiting people's homes. Well, they were not able to navigate stairs, they were in a wheelchair. It would be an undue hardship to request the company install an elevator in every personal home that they needed to happen to visit so that they could access all areas of the home. Besides the expense, it's just simply not practical, not possible. And that would be an undue hardship for the company. And then also, you can't ask to change your supervisor as an accommodation. You can't make staffing decisions for the company working for as an accommodation. So those are some of the areas where there are limits to accommodations. It might seem a little bit nebulous or undefined, but in the practical examples that we see, it's usually extremely clear what's reasonable, what's unreasonable, what's an undue hardship. And again, most accommodations are very easy to accommodate. Accommodations also need to be effective. Accommodation request does not demand for specific accommodation, but the need for accommodation. So if you're an employee with a disability and you're writing this ADA request, it is a request. It's to open a dialogue to find a solution. You can make a recommendation about what solution you believe will work, but that's not necessarily the final solution that we will come to in this process. An accommodation needs to be effective, but not necessarily best. The employer may offer additional accommodations beyond what was requested. An example here, an employee requests a video enlargement system for a small print that they occasionally need to read on the job. The employer offers a magnifying glass. The magnifying glass will be an effective accommodation. That is an acceptable solution. So once a month, I had to read some very small print in limited quantity of it. And I asked for an accommodation of make a recommendation to the employer. I need a video enlargement system so I can read this text. They say, here's a magnifying glass, see if that works. And I try it and it works. Well, that's an effective solution. Is it the best solution? No, of course not. I'd love to have my video enlargement system. Maybe it'd be helpful for other things. Maybe there's a case to be made for that need if I have to regularly read small text. But if it's just once in a while, then the simple solution of a magnifying glass might be fine. Also, the employer could say, hey, we have all this other accessibility equipment. Why don't you just take it? Maybe it'll help you. You didn't ask for it. It's beyond what I recommended as a solution and beyond my effective accommodation. And that's fine on the employer's part. Not sure how often that will actually happen, but there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, so to recap, Accommodations about empowering a person with a disability to be able to do the job. Accommodations can be many things depending on the situation. Limits to accommodations are defined by what will work and reasonableness. Again, slightly nebulous, but in the practical, it becomes pretty obvious. So this is Computer Technologies Program. We're a workforce development agency. We work with people with disabilities since 1974. We have many professional volunteer opportunities for people who are in the working world who would like to work with the participants in our program and help them prepare for careers. And we provide education for employers and employees with disabilities. Thank you.